It's time to get some detail into our requirements. And on Agile projects, we build out the detail of our requirements using what we call user stories. Now, user stories are hopefully not a new concept to you if you've been doing story maps already. And the reason I say that is your story map probably looks like this. And your user stories are nothing but the little tasks that you've identified here, 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 and here. Now, uh, if you've read any books on user stories, and there's a really good book by Mike Cohn called User Stories Applied, it talks about the format of as a I want to so that. And the user story map uh, lends itself really well to be able to construct those story titles. Let's see how that happens. So you've obviously constructed your story maps from the perspective of a bunch of personas. And so that's where you get your as a. And here you can see there are certain users. So let's say this is as a novice user, and it could be something else, but I'm just writing it down there. I want to, and I want to add to my basket, or I want to place my order, or I want to pay on delivery, so that I can buy a product. And so you will notice that different parts of the story map will link to each other to actually create that story title. So if somebody asks you, oh, how are you going to translate your story map into user stories? It's actually doing that for you automatically. And that is one of the reasons why we introduced it to you in the first place. So thank us later.
Right.
All right.
So I think one thing that we need to remember is like we said earlier, story maps helps us tell stories. So even when you break down stories and write stories, try to tell stories, narrate stories, not detail your requirement. If you just keep that in mind, I think it'll be much easier to tell stories well.
Yeah. Now, this particular video is about getting the size of your stories right. And one of the principles, or one of the sets of principles that we talk about is invest. And I'll go through them one by one, and they have some handy hints on how you might want to split your stories if they're looking too big. So for example, it says your stories need to be independent. And if you start seeing too many dependencies, which are split across tasks in your story map, then it probably makes sense to merge dependencies into a single stories. Now, of course, there may be a case where you cannot merge them into a single story, and there is an invest principle that invalidates exactly what I'm saying, but I'll come to that in a bit. The other part of it is that it needs to be negotiable, right? So discuss the essence of every requirement with your stakeholders. Uh, you want to deliver value. You want to understand what is it that you're achieving for the user, and you keep the scope of a story limited only to what you want to achieve for the user in that case. And that also goes along with a story being valuable. So for example, login. Uh, as a user, I want to log into the system so that I can access the system. You can achieve this with a simple username and password. Now, if your stakeholders talks about adding in Facebook integration or Google integration into this, what you start doing is conflating two kinds of value. One value is accessing the system in the first place. The other piece of value is integrating with a system I'm already signed on to. You can deliver that as a separate story. So that's something to consider. Your story needs to be estimable. And when we say estimable, if it becomes too complex where your team and you find it difficult to estimate, that's a sign that your story is too big and you need to split. Coming to small, if your story is too big to complete in an iteration, and generally our iterations are about 2 weeks long, then that you should consider splitting. And this is where I was saying that it'll conflict with what we said about independent. We said merge all dependencies into one story. But if that means that your story becomes too big to complete an iteration, then you need to consider splitting. And last but not least, your story needs to be testable. So if you're generating a large number of criteria that come together for acceptance of that story. I know we've introduced a term called acceptance criteria. We'll come to that in a later video. But generally, there is a set of criteria that tells you that a story is done. If that becomes really complex and that becomes really large, then again, consider splitting. So those are some good principles to keep at the back of your mind, when you decide what the right size of your story should be.
Right. One note on testability is also that maybe certain stories can just be tasks, and you can never test whether a story is actually meeting the goal or not. If that is not the case, then you're not able to test. So the idea is to test from an end user perspective, and not really test whether the code was written well. Um, so I think that is key. If you're not able to test anything out of the story, or there is no way to test a story, then maybe it's just a time to relook at how the story was split and what was included.
Yeah, and I think that leads to slicing, right? Richa, you want to talk about that?
Right. So when we say, the reason why we call it slicing is, one of the metaphors we use is that slice your stories like a cake, where you can enjoy all the layers of the cake. So maybe some of us may enjoy just licking the cream top of the cake, but most of us would want to, cut the cake in a pie so that we can eat it well. Similarly, for stories, I think the slices translate to three layers, which is normally front end, the services, and persistence. And you would hear the devs say stuff like the UI layer, which is the front end layer, the API layer, which is again the services layer, and then the database layer, which is nothing but persistence. So a story cannot be that I will just create a table in a database, and that's about it, right? The user is not getting value out of it. So there is no value. Maybe we might get value in the end, but each of the story has to be valuable, which we can't compromise on, right? So try as much as you can to slice it across all of these three layers. So slice it vertically, unlike you slice a story map horizontally. So I think that's I know that might be counterintuitive, but that's the logic. Some of you may just be creating APIs and maybe working on a platform. In that context, I think slicing across services and persistence is a good idea, because that's the scope of the project, because there could be like multiple front ends on top of it. But just creating an API where there is an integration with the database layer somewhere, and then front-end integration somewhere, integrations always create complexity in the end. Slicing it vertically will always eliminate all the risks that you may foresee across integration and further things well in advance. So even if your first story is complex, it's fine, but strive for vertical slicing as much as possible.
Yeah, and there'll always be exceptions to this, right? We'll discuss the exceptions in more detail at a certain point of time. But definitely, as you're building a new product, and especially if it's a user-facing product, doing this whole vertical slicing works. Now, of course, you might have an existing product where you're moving to a new UI framework, and then if it's just about changing the UI framework, then you will probably have to, break it down into smaller tasks and look at it as, just the top slice. Granted that those situations exist, but do understand that this is from the perspective of new product development.
Yeah. So without taking so much of the time, I think we've created two decks, which talks about what is a user story, and what are the principles to split stories, and then what are the various techniques and ways that we follow while splitting stories. So please go through these documents. These are immensely helpful. And if you have any doubts, if you have any questions while going through any of these documents, grab any BA on the floor, and I'm sure they'll be happy to help you.
Yeah, and you'll find links to the documents in the description and in the course materials. So go through them. There's quite a few examples in there, and that'll just help you in the whole self-study process. All right, should we talk about how, what goes into a great story? We can do that in the next video.
Absolutely, yeah.